wherever those are persecuted, that place we tackle case by case.
Cases, where we believe that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Al-Etejah News Channel. The truth fears no questions.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Stream. I'm your host, Sarah Musa. It is Syria's strategic location in the Middle East that makes it necessary for the United States to intervene. Are we worried that continued chaos there would sow instability across the region? Wouldn't the measures being talked about, missile strikes to cripple Assad's air force, establishment of a no-fly zone, giving the rebels heavy weapons, tend to make the situation more chaotic rather than less? Is the U.S. in approval of a military intervention by giving Israel the green light and being silent on the violation and aggression? Are the war drums rolling? Are the regional powers ready to fire? Questions we will answer with our dear guest joining us in the studio, founder and director of the Conflicts Forum, Alastair Crooke, and via Skype from London, Ammar Waqqaf, member of the Syrian Social Club. Dear guest, Mr. Alastair, and of course, Mr. Waqqaf, hello and welcome to Middle East Stream.
Thank you.
Allow us, before we start, to move on to our report, see the latest news in Syria and in the region, watch it together.
In its continuous aggression on neighboring countries, the Israeli air forces conducted several airstrikes in Damascus, leaving behind huge destruction. Commentators argued that the Israeli offensive act followed the considerable advancement of the Syrian army against the opposition forces and al-Nusra extremist group. Several reports indicate the Israeli Air Force used depleted uranium shells in the attack, which many commentators considered a very dangerous development that could drag the area into a regional war. On his part, the Syrian Information Minister Ammar Waqqaf stated in a press conference that his country had the right and the duty to defend its people by all available means, assuring that, quote, all options are on the table now, unquote. In his first comment on the attack, U.S. President Barack Obama said Israel had the right to defend itself, leaving the doors open for future attacks. Syria's foreign ministry has sent 2 letters to the UN and its Security Council, stating that Israel's aggressions proved the link between Tel Aviv and terrorist groups operating in Syria, including al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front. The Israeli aggression was condemned by Iran, Egypt and Lebanon, among others, while the UN, the Arab League, Russia and China voiced great concerns over the airstrikes and their repercussions. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry arrived Tuesday in Moscow for a meeting with President Vladimir Putin. While some analysts argue that such meetings might push for a diplomatic solution for the Syrian crisis, others are skeptical and believe that the Americans will not withdraw their proxies from Syria and therefore fight this war to the end.
Once again, hello and welcome, Mr. Alastair, and of course, Mr. Ammar joining us via Skype from London. Allow me to start with you, Mr. Alastair. The situation right now, the timing of the attack by the Israelis, what's your analysis on that?
I think there are 2 aspects to it which are together interlinked. I think one aspect of the timing is connected with the fact that President Assad's forces, the Syrian army, has made major successes on the military front, both in the borders with Lebanon, in the south and also in the east of Damascus, and opened the way. I think both in Israel and Washington there's been a reading that it's almost impossible for President Obama and for some Western heads of state to accept a resurgence of President Assad and Syria as a state in this way. I think that is one element, so perhaps it was intended to give a certain fillip and a help to the opposition armed forces. But I think the primary purpose of Israel had nothing to do with this. I think the primary purpose here and what Israel was trying to do is essentially to push, if you like, the American domestic context towards intervention in Syria by showing an intervention that's happened, an intervention that it was very hard for President Obama to react against, to push back, because it was stated that it was about stopping the armaments flowing to Hezbollah, and for America that's a terrorist group and therefore difficult for it to push back. Why? Because I think ultimately the aim is that if you can, if you like, push an American intervention in Syria, it will be that much easier then to push for an American intervention. The red lines start to disappear and it becomes easier to move towards Iran. And I think that is ultimately the target.
Let's see what Mr. Ammar has to say on that. Mr. Ammar, Mr. Alastair is saying that perhaps this could be a military intervention start. Do you see that as well?
I actually concur completely with Mr. Crooke's analysis. I believe that I've seen a statistical report published by the BBC in which all the Western countries that are called England, France, Germany, the vast majority of the population are against arming the rebels, for example, let alone thinking of a military intervention, and probably the Israelis would want that appetite to change. It's easy to strike hard within Syria without really the fear of major losses, because that's the main argument we hear day in and day out here in the Western Hemisphere. But I also think that this is very much about boosting morale of the rebel side, and to tell them that we can actually help you a little bit with regards to killing a few Syrian soldiers, striking at certain armed depots and so on and so forth, and rescue them in a sense from the losses that they have suffered, as you're right, honourable gentleman. The honourable gentleman in your studio said that they suffered in east and south Damascus, and indeed in al-Alastair area on the borders with Lebanon. The work has been made. I mean, we don't know exactly yet the technicalities of the strike, how it happened. Some say there were planes, some others suggest that actually planes never entered Syrian airspace. And there has been talk about some restraint exerted, or calls for restraint exerted by the Russians and the Iranians. But actually, the Syrian government is now under tremendous pressure from its population and its supporters to do something about it.
Yeah, there was a little bit when we were talking. We tried to get someone from the opposition to join us in the episode. They were telling us that we were really mad at the government, at the Syrian regime. Why did they not respond to that? They want to unite against the Israeli aggression. However, they were mad. What's your stance on that? I mean, were you also expecting a response from the Syrian regime at a time where, as you said, the regime is pressured somehow?
Well, let's start with the Israeli calculations. I would probably think that the Israelis have calculated that the Syrians, having their army really deployed all over Syria, cannot really afford to have a serious challenge against the Israeli army, because logistically they cannot really mount a serious challenge, and they would probably want, having won a few battles recently, to finish off some work to a certain extent. Hezbollah alone won't be able to do things on its own because of internal politics within Lebanon, and probably the combined axis of the resistance between Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah don't really see this moment as the right moment for the final showdown with Israel. So from the Israeli point of view, they thought that they could actually strike hard within Syria, not the usual skirmish that we see, but actually this one was really big, and get away with it. And by that, the surge in the popularity of the government, of President Assad in specific, could actually suffer, because the population cannot stand the humiliation of having to, receive blow after blow, and especially a major one like that one, without the government really having to do anything about it. So they win, in their opinion, they win both sides. So with regards to President Assad, we've seen that he made a public appearance immediately the day after with the Martyr Children's School. He's trying to say, you know, we're going to continue as we are. There is a, you know, a bit of popularity that is going on and so on. And, you know, people are really excited with the advances that we're making on the ground. Still, there is a sense, and I can report this because nobody that I speak to doesn't report it. Everyone that I speak to feels the same almost. People, you know, feel the need to do something. And there are all sorts of arguments why Syria should do something about it. It's internal, it's external, it's even with regards to the international, you know, public opinion. Just like, you know, Mr. Crooke said, if Israel gets away with such a strike and Syria does nothing to do, does nothing to counter that, that could be painful for Israel, then what could prevent the Americans from saying, well, actually, we can go and in and out and you know, have no casualties at all, and it should be a low-risk operation. So
is that
Syria
more of the same
something.
scenario that was set in Iraq?
Yes, yes, because Iraq was quite depleted when the American and their allies, when the Americans and their allies arrived in April 2003. They even, you know, up to the last al-Sumud missile, they were really interested in decommissioning those. And, you know, they had an Iraqi army with no air defense. They could have air superiority from day one. They could push on with their sophisticated, you know, armaments and so on. And the Iraqis really stood no chance. So the line has been so far in the Western Hemisphere throughout, you know, even the politicians are really stating that this is not going to be easy for our forces to go in, say, and apply a no-flying zone. Unlike Libya, the Syrian army is well, you know, armored. They have sophisticated weapons, anti-aircraft, and so on and so forth. And it's not going to be risk-free. With a, you know, action like that from the Israelis, I totally agree with your guest, that sort of public illusion, so to speak, from the Israeli point of view, obviously, can be shattered.
Allow me to move a question to you, Mr. Alastair. We have two actual conclusions on what happened. First, as you just mentioned, Israel said that we targeted Syria because they were moving missiles to Hezbollah or by Hezbollah. So basically what was said is that the real target was Hezbollah in Lebanon and not the Syrians. And however, they were saying that they were trying to ease the way for Western intervention into Syria. My question is, we also saw silence from some of the neighboring countries to Syria. The silence after that, what does that mean? Are they assisting the Western intervention into Syria?
I think it's very clear that this is the plan and this is what they are interested in. Incidentally, it's not entirely clear. Some reports are suggesting that Hezbollah has successfully received effective weapons during this period. And perhaps what we saw in Damascus on Sunday was the fruitless, if you like, results of that effort to intercept and destroy that passage of weapons to Hezbollah, and Israel trying to give a demonstrative political example to show that it did not like this and it was quite angry with it. Yes, I think what we're seeing in the West, and I think it's quite a dangerous move, supported by Israel, is to create this, what they call this group of 4+1, which is 4 main Sunni states plus Turkey. And again, this is supposed to be a self-defense, a defensive operation that would cooperate with the United States in a military way, but also, of course, do 2 other things. One would be to serve in support of Israel, and secondly, to help shoehorn Palestinians into occupation, posing as some form of statehood. So I think that is an element, but it will exacerbate increasingly, if it works, which may be doubtful, the already high sectarian tensions in the region.
But the sectarian tension has always been there. I mean, the Sushi war, as they call it, the Sunni Shiite war, has always been in the region. They have always sowed sectarianism what does it make
I
a
think
difference right now?
No, I think that's not entirely true. There have been periods when that hasn't been the case, but we're seeing now something which is much more significant. 25 years ago, I was working on the borders of Afghanistan in that period, supporting and directly dealing with the resistance. Much of that area, Afghanistan, northern area, was Islamically pluralist, and people lived together quite happily. Much of it was, in fact, Sufi at that time. Now we've had a cultural Salafist revolution, and it's become overwhelmingly a Salafist hegemony. Now this is the turn of this part of the world, and we're seeing this taking place. So it is important, and the upturn, the heating up of, if you like, Sunni radicalism throughout the region, which we can see everywhere, I believe will be as dangerous as what we saw 25 years ago in Afghanistan, if not more so. So I don't think it's just, you know, more of the same. I think it's something that is quite different. And the sectarian language, of course, legitimizes and empowers, of course, the takfiri and the most extreme elements of sectarianism
with extremism. So that's
of course, and it legitimizes it and silences the middle ground.
Of course, allow us to move on to our first break, and we have a lot to talk about on the Syrian situation. There's more to go on the topic. Stay tuned.
Beyond the lines, beyond the surface. Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse.
Beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
Welcome back to Middle East Stream. Mr. Alastair, thanks again for being with us. Allow me to move a question to Mr. Ammar from London. Mr. Ammar, we have an analysis that says that, of course, had it not been for the green light from the US, Israel wouldn't have attacked Syria. And they also questioned, why would Washington want to use Tel Aviv right now at this moment?
The media here in the UK, at least, and the 48 hours that, came before the strike, and everyone, including the foreign minister here, William Hague, was talking about Israel's right to do something about shipments to Hezbollah. So there was a sort of preparation for the public opinion here before, having the strike itself. And that would clearly suggest a clear line, a green light. Why would they want to do it? Again, we go back to the advances probably that the Syrian army has made throughout the past few weeks. Apparently, there is some point in the very future that everybody envisages at that point. There's going to be, people sitting on the table and discussing how things are going to be for the future of Syria. And every single party, obviously, is trying to pull the ropes as much as possible to their side and to their benefit at this moment in time. And probably the West in America were alarmed at the advances that the Syrian army made, so they wanted to stop that in their tracks. They wanted to stop them in their tracks. For example, there's a meeting that's scheduled next month between President Obama of America and President Putin of Russia, and apparently things are going to be settled.
Of course, there's a meeting that is set today, and of course, according to that meeting, we will be talking about the Russian and the American stances on the situation in Syria and whether America will convince Russia or Russia convince America. However, in our second part of the show, but allow me to ask one question to you. We have today the affiliated groups to al-Qaeda within Syria, and many reports did mention that a lot of weapons were sent to that groups. today when we hear people speaking about weapons being sent to Hezbollah, and we see an attack suddenly on that group as a terrorist group, why has nothing been said towards the fact that weapons are also being sent to Jabhat al-Nusra?
Indeed, I totally agree. I actually don't agree that Hezbollah is a terrorist group. I mean, Hezbollah never carried a suicide bombing in the streets of London, for example, or New York. It is only, you know, sarcastically speaking, it is only the groups that were funded and trained historically, starting from Afghanistan, obviously, by the West that have turned against them. Now, there are a few issues here that can be discussed. We have to take into consideration as an element what the Syrian opposition tell the West. In my opinion, they might be, you know, very, you know, intentionally deceiving them about the realities in Syria. They might be telling them, you know, this Jabhat al-Nusra or this al-Qaeda intellect is alien to our society and culture as Syrians. And once we get rid of the regime, it would be very easy for us, being very moderate Syrians and so on, to get rid of those, you know, alien groups. And the West might want to believe them a little bit, so you don't hear much of a fuss about, you know, the West arming al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra. In fact, I can cite here an incident that took place, that when Ayman al-Zawahiri, the chief al-Qaeda, you know, the chief of al-Qaeda, issued a video back in July 2011. This was like 3 or 4 months into the Syrian crisis, calling for jihad in Syria. And after that video, and for the establishment of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the front for aiding those in distress.
So are you saying that that was pre-planned? I mean, the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri back in July 2011, at the beginning of the so-called revolutions in the Arab Spring, you're saying that Ayman al-Zawahiri called for the jihadists to enter Syria, so that means that it was pre-planned.
Well, of course, there is a whole intellect amongst the jihadi groups with regards to the states that surround Israel. They say that it is very necessary to topple the regimes because those regimes haven't been doing anything for the past 50 or 60 years but guarding the borders of Israel. So their intellect, their doctrine actually is to topple regimes, prepare the land as fertile to start launching suicide and the jihadi operations into Palestine. So Ayman al-Zawahiri in July 2011, in compliance with that doctrine actually, called for jihad in Syria, and the first suicide bombing took place about 5 months later. Now, what was interesting on the day is that you know, all the mainstream Western media ignored completely that specific video. I mean, here in the UK, we only saw the Guardian newspaper mentioning it, and if you Google it now, and if you try to search the likes of the BBC or Sky News, you won't have a trace of that video. They completely ignored it, and it was easy thus for them 5 months later, when the first suicide bombing took place in Damascus, to actually say, well, who the hell are al-Qaeda? Actually, we're gonna point the finger at the regime. So they were, I think, you know, complicit and deliberately complicit with the intentions of al-Qaeda. They knew it from the very beginning. I'm not going as far as saying they are helping them directly, but at least they are letting them do whatever they want.
Of course, Mr. Ammar, a lot of analysis came out after the bomb happened in Boston that the backfire started ever since the West was actually setting up plans with the extremist groups. Allow me to move a question to you, Mr. Alastair. Today there's an alliance between al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and Israel after the attack. Jabhat al-Nusra attacking in the explosions in Syria, and then we have Israel's aggression. Isn't that an alliance right now, and what does that mean?
I think it's not a direct alliance, but there is a tacit, if you like, understanding. And this has been expressed and made clear really since 2007, when the first articles have come out, where in the wake of the 2006 war here in Lebanon, it was clear that the United States and its allies were moving towards trying to create a Sunni bloc that could constrain Iran. And by implication, of course, was that it would end up by espousing in some way Sunni extremists within that element. So I think it's been implicit but not explicit in Western policy since earlier than before 2011. And of course now we have the testimony from, in fact, the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq, who said very clearly that the groups, al-Nusra groups, were set up in early 2000 in Syria, undercover and not publicly, but first of all to facilitate, if you like, the weapons and the transfer of recruits into Iraq there. So we have had a long, if you like, lead into this process. And yes, the West is tacitly doing this. Of course, it cannot. It talks about ensuring that weapons don't go to extremists. But from my own experience before in Afghanistan, of course, that's impossible to enforce. The weapons are distributed. No one can control the weapons. And in fact, after the war in Afghanistan, the Americans spent a lot of money trying to claw back weapons that had, as they saw it, fallen into the wrong hands. So it's inevitable in these
The Americans
operations.
themselves were questioning. I mean, didn't the Americans learn from Iraq and Afghanistan the experience? For decades they have been in the same situation, actually. And the Americans themselves today, with articles that I've been reading, they were asking, why hasn't the U.S. learned from what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq?
I actually don't believe that we see governments learn any lessons from history. People keep saying we learn lessons from history. All I see, and I've spent 25, 30 years involved in these areas, is governments and states and leaders repeating the same patterns of behavior and getting the same results, although expecting that they'll work out differently on each occasion. Unfortunately, we don't learn from history. We don't learn from what happened. That's why I believe that what we're going to see will be actually more serious and have wider consequences than that episode in Afghanistan in nearly 25, 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that had huge consequences. 2 wars in the region, the war on terror, all of these things emerged from that period.
And aren't they aware of that scenario?
No, and I think in many ways it's very similar. Why didn't they worry about it then? I remember in '87 trying to warn the Americans about some of the groups. Some of them had real roots in the community, but others, I believe, were a danger. And what did they say? And they said, well, Alastair, listen, you know, that's really interesting, the warning about some of these groups, but you know, those groups you warn us about, they're the very ones that kick communist ass. And that was all that mattered. No one wanted to look. You turned the other way. You didn't see what was actually happening on the ground in Afghanistan with the emergence of these groups. And I believe that's the same thing now. You know, it's good domestically for the West to kick Gaddafi's ass, to kick Assad's ass. This goes down well. We're ridding the world of tyrants. It looks, when they have domestic problems, that they haven't got any solution.
Is that the way it is? I mean, are they really saving the region from the leaders that they were allies with, such as Gaddafi and Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak?
You know, it's nonsense. But, you know, the West is in deep crisis, financial crisis, political stasis at the moment, for which there are very few solutions. It's much easier for Western leaders who are accused of being weak and feeble to grandstand in Mali or to go to the refugee camps in Jordan and to sound strong and tough when it's very likely that they're not going to have to do anything. Much better than trying to sort out the financial crisis there is in Europe. So this is narrative. This is a language. They create the narrative demonizing Gaddafi, demonizing Assad. The problem with that narrative is you can't move back from it. And it obstructs and erases any alternative understanding or strategic understanding of what you're doing. It's reduced to the simplistic thing of here's a tyrant, he must go, and then everything will be fine. And of course it's nonsense. Life isn't like that. We all know that. And certainly that is not the case in Syria, where I think certainly states like Russia, Iran, and China believe that Assad has support of a majority of the Syrian people. And I think that's almost certainly true.
Mr. Ammar from London, we know that the foreign minister of Syria actually sent a letter to the UN and Security Council. Do you think that the international community and the UN will point fingers to Israel, knowing that this is not the first time that the Israelis violate or head to an aggression into Syria?
I think any attempt at the Security Council to have a condemnation is going to be very much hit right on the head by the Americans, who already, by President Obama and top officials, have justified what Israel has done and actually framed it within the framework of retaliating or having a preemptive strike against Hezbollah. Nobody asked the question whether, okay, Hezbollah in Lebanon, why don't you bomb in Lebanon? But so I don't think the international community is going to do anything about it, actually. But I would like to catch up on what Mr. Crooke said. I believe that the issue in Syria, yes, Jabhat al-Nusra was definitely established in Syria in the early 2000s. I think the whole episode that we are living now has been brewing since 2003, when Iraq was invaded. And as a result of this invasion, the Saudis felt a sort of loss in the geostrategic influence game between them and Iran to the Iranians because of the certain demographies in Iraq. And they wanted immediately to compensate in Syria, and we had this Fertile Crescent concept that immediately sprouted out in 2003 and announced by the Jordanian monarch Abdullah II. So this has been brewing. I mean, we felt it in Syria. We felt that there was tension growing. In Syria, it was not very much on the surface, but actually in Lebanon, where this studio is, it was obvious that everyone is blatantly trying to put the Sunni population of Lebanon into a sort of defensive position. You know, they are coming at you, they're going to have you, you need to gather yourself, you need to believe in your culture and so on and so forth. And we're going to help you defend yourselves, whilst actually there was no apparent threat at all. With regards to the issue of Afghanistan, at the time when Afghanistan was, the Operation Cyclone and so on and so forth, led by the Americans, obviously, and the British, this was an operation against a sort of an ailing strategic foe, which is the USSR. Everyone knew that the USSR at the time had its internal issues, and probably Afghanistan was, was used to finish it off, which actually it did. But with regards to what is happening in Syria now, actually, it's the other way around. It is the Western economies that are very bad in shape. They're very much geared with debt, and this debt is only going to come
But
from
would
the likes of
intervening
China
in
and
Syria
Russia.
make it easier for them on that matter?
Yes, they don't want to, they're fighting for their lives here. So my point was going to be, if the point I was going to make is that even though they might have learned, and I would probably doubt it as well, from the lesson in Afghanistan, they cannot afford not to intervene in Syria in the tried and tested way as they did in Afghanistan. So probably they don't have the luxury in the West to lose out in this Middle Eastern game. They want to secure the Middle East as a market, as a bargaining power that would give them bargaining power against the likes of China and Russia and the rest of the BRIC countries. And we've seen, China really expanding in Africa and really biting all these, mineral and commodity market over there. So I think the Western economies don't have the luxury of saying, well, we've learned from Afghanistan that this is going to hit us later on, 20 years down the line. Actually, we need to act now because we're calculating in months rather than in decades now.
Mr. Ammar and Mr. Alastair, after the break, we're going to be talking about the talks between the Russians and the Americans and whether the future of Syria will be saved by the Russians, as many expect. More to go after our last episode. Dear viewers, more to go on this topic, of course, after our last break. Stay tuned.
Time. Variable. Event. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The Globe on our platform.
Welcome back to Middle East Stream. Mr. Alastair, allow us to talk about the chemical weapons right before moving on to the Russian and American talks. The UN was investigating on that matter, and the latest that came up was they were deducing that the chemical weapons were in fact used by the militants within Syria. Why is it a red line for the US, for the regime to use the chemical weapons? However, it's not a red line for the other groups that are affiliated to al-Qaeda to use chemical weapons.
We've been through now, this last month has been very clearly an episode of, if you like, information war, propaganda war. And chemical weapons have been the propaganda tool. I think it's fairly clear that this has been something that has not happened by accident, but has been very clearly contrived. You see Britain and France suggesting that they've found evidence of it. None of this has stood up, even with the experts who've looked at the videos and the films. But clearly, again, there are forces that are pushing for an intervention within an American intervention.
We saw stances from David Cameron actually pointing out to having real evidence on that, but yes. However they were...
But they weren't able to produce it, in fact challenged in Parliament to produce it. They have failed to do so. And it's quite clear in Washington, they've been backtracking from this very clearly.
Doesn't that weaken their stance?
Of course. But in some ways it actually helps President Obama, because the story about the chemical weapons being used and the suggestion that there was some evidence clearly was putting pressure on him from people in the US, from Congress and other political figures, that he must respond. But now Carla Del Ponte has come up and said, well, actually, the only evidence points in the other direction. So it's enabling Obama, I believe, to stand back a little bit and say, well, look, no, let's wait and see till we find any evidence about anything before we move. So I think that this has been something of a reversal for Israel in that context, this happening at this time. We see quite clearly now Obama and the White House stepping back from it, which means that Netanyahu is rather exposed after this last attack. There's no sign of America rushing in to support him in a military sense. So you think that
had there been proof that the regime did use chemical weapons, that perhaps the aggression would have continued?
Look, I don't think for a moment we'll find that there has been evidence from of the government using chemical. In fact, anyway, we're not talking about weapons, we're talking about inhibiting agents, basically. Sarin gas is not a weapon. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we're seeing that. And first of all, why? Because, first of all, Russia has been monitoring all of these weapons and been quite satisfied that it has them securely under their control.
But there was a refusal by Barack Obama to have any of the Russians investigate in that matter at the beginning of it.
Maybe, but the Russians are there. The Russians are directly involved and have said very clearly, and in the Security Council, we have looked at this, we have inspected it, and we are satisfied that they are entirely secure. The other aspect to it, which is just as important, is Iran has said very clearly, from their own experience, if you like, from war, they're a red line for us, as much as they're a red line for the United States. There can be no use of chemical weapons. So I think it's highly unlikely we'll see any government-authorized use of even chemical inhibiting agents in this period. And if they have been used, maybe it is part of a deception or an exercise to try and produce it. But I think this phase has really come to an end. I don't think the chemical weapons story really is running very much. So now we've had this weapons to Hezbollah as a new pretext, if you like, to try and push towards some intervention. But I keep coming back, and I'd like to come back and say again that the ultimate object of pushing Obama into an intervention in Syria is not necessarily to have the intervention in Syria, but to put Western pressure on Obama to say, well, you can't act like this on Iran, and to push him off his red lines on Iran, which are different red lines, of course, and to make it easier for Israel to try and set new red lines for the United States about Iran. So much of this, I think, is about manipulating the US political arena as much as it is about actually whether there will be intervention on the ground in Syria at this stage. For Israel, this is the major objective. It's not Syria, because they see Syria as already preoccupied with its internal trouble. It's not a threat to Israel in their perspective.
So basically it's more of Hezbollah, it's basically more of Iran.
Iran.
Let's see if Mr. Ammar agrees on that. Mr. Ammar, what do you have to say on what Mr. Alastair just pointed out?
I agree as well. I think for the moment at least, their major issue is Iran. Actually, it has been for the past at least 5 years since they started making all the noise about the Iranian nuclear facility development and weapon capability development and so on. And they've been trying to push the West to intervene somehow, or to at least pay the bill for an Israeli intervention. They want to kickstart some sort of a chaotic situation whereby they have a free hand of going and bombing, or probably an internal problem in Iran, just like the one that is happening at the moment in Syria, whereby the Iranian government is going to go weaker and weaker, and probably in the best of scenarios, the regime would be toppled in Iran. So at the moment, I totally agree. I don't think Israel sees Syria as a threat. Syria is not going to be at the moment, as far as well, let's put it this way. We understand that the major striking force, or the bulk of the strategic power of the Syrian army, has not been used. So it's there, and it's sort of having a deterrence against Israeli intervention, and may be used. It's not used in the day-to-day warfare that is taking place, against the rebels or the militants. However, I really doubt that the Syrian government would want to start a fight at the moment with Israel. With regards to the chemical weapons, Syria, if they have the chemical weapons, they've announced somehow that they have it, but they're not going to allow someone to come and take it. No one is going to allow a reenactment of the scenario in Iraq, where Iraqi teeth were pulled out one by one pre the American invasion in 2003. No one is going to allow that in Syria. So Syria, in a sense, is really paying the price with all the support that the rebel forces and the militants and the propaganda to incite them more and more against the Syrian army and the Syrian government that is taking place.
Mm-hmm. Allow me to move a question to you, Mr. Alastair. There's a meeting between Putin and John Kerry, Secretary of State. Will that mean that the Americans might convince the Russians to change their stances on Syria, or vice versa? Because there's a lot of analysis on that, and people are awaiting the response.
Well, the reporting that's coming out now from Israel in these last few hours is showing something quite different. It's showing that President Putin actually challenged John Kerry very strongly, and to Netanyahu, and said that if there is another attack on Syria, we will not accept that. Russia will not accept it and will take action, and said furthermore that we will reciprocate by increasing the weapons. Any weaponization of Syria, we will increase the weapons that we supply to the government, to the President Assad's government in Syria.
Would that silence...
So we've had a very, very strong response. Equally, in China, where Netanyahu is at the moment, he's received a not quite so a verbal attack, but he's received a very cold reception from the Chinese at this time. So there have been repercussions, and Russia has said very clearly that this is a red line for them. And I think all the time, I've been dealing with this, I've been speaking to the Russians quite considerably during this period. You've seen this line, oh, the Russians are about to come onto the west side, the Russians are about to change their position. And of course the Russians have not, because this is an existential issue for Russia. They understand what happens. They see the line as Yugoslavia, Libya, then Syria, then next Iran, then perhaps even a former Soviet state, and finally Russia itself. Unless they draw a line in the sand here and stop the process by which the West sets itself up as the arbiter of regimes, the ability to delegitimize this president, legitimize that one, outside of the role of the UN, outside of international law, then there's going to be a huge strategic price to be paid by China and Russia itself. It's about the whole international order that the Russians are taking the stance, not about Tartus or a base for ships. So I don't think we'll see a change from the Russians.
So the firm stance coming from the Russians, would it actually silence the Western moves? Or
I think it will make Netanyahu very, very hesitant about another attack. And I believe that President Assad, and we don't know this definitely, but there are many reports that he has said, and this seems quite likely, that he's warned through Moscow to the Israelis that any further, a third attack, will be insupportable and we'll have to react against it. Any president, cannot support those criticisms as we heard earlier of the people saying, well, why don't you do something about it? But equally also, Syria, I'm sure, has a long memory of '67, and it was precisely this sort of provocation in the demilitarized zone that actually began '67 and that disastrous war for Syria at that time. So they're going to be much more cautious, and in fact, the response by Putin, I think, will be very pleasing to. And in any case, President Assad is achieving successes on the battlefield. Why does he want to be diverted by fighting some war with Israel at this point? Let him focus on what is his main interest, and which is the interests of the Syrian people, which is the re-establishment of some sort of security within Syria. So I think that will be what we will see.
Hopefully. Mr. Ammar, the Russian stances, it has been very firm, and it has stuck to Bashar al-Assad all along, and perhaps that's why Bashar al-Assad is quite powerful in his position today. The opposition today, they are against Bashar al-Assad, and they were really mad at the fact that, as Mr. Alastair was mentioning, that there was no response by the government. They were really mad at that. Do you see any unity between the opposition and you at a time where you were attacked by the Israelis? Would that actually unite the Syrians, or would you be divided now that they are mad at not responding?
I mean, I've heard opposition claims over the past 2 days that went as laughable as saying, well, there was a group of very senior officers in the Republican Guard that were about to defect from the Syrian army, so President Bashar al-Assad called upon the Israelis to come and bomb them. There was a lot of cheering by the opposition, by the way, for this attack. It clearly takes a little bit of burden off their chests with regards to the defeats and the bad situation that they are in on the Lebanese border and around Damascus. It's almost total encirclement. So I don't think they might be saying only it's about teasing and taunting the government. Why are you not retaliating? Doesn't mean that they really want the government to retaliate. They're just telling their supporters, and the government supporters are trying to tell them that the government is hopeless. They cannot do anything about it. Obviously, in the past few days, some news surfaced from Syria that the Russians were quite adamant in telling the Syrians not to do anything in retaliations, and this gives President Assad, I think, a good bargaining power with the Russians as well. You told me not to retaliate, so what are you going to do about it? Hence, should the reports, be true about the Kerry-Putin standoff, it makes a little bit of sense. We need to understand that the Syrian government's main concern from the very beginning of this crisis.
I guess we have a technical problem with Mr. Ammar. I want to thank, of course, Mr. Ammar for being with us in our episode. One last question to you, Mr. Alastair. The situation in Syria, will it move to Lebanon as people are expecting or not, where things will be headed to?
Yes, it's already moved here, in my view, and more than that, it's also moved to Iraq, and it's also moved to Jordan. And inevitably, the idea that you can simply sort of have a self-contained little insurgency to bring down a hated figure for the West, and that it will not pulsate in stability, sectarianism, and hatred throughout the region is nuts.
Hopefully. Mr. Alastair Crooke, thank you so much for being with us. And once again, of course, Mr. Ammar Waqqaf, thank you for joining us via Skype from London. Dear viewers, that's all we have for Middle East Stream. Thank you for watching, and peace be upon you.